Hello. So I read some books over the last, I think, I want to say 2 months to a month. This book took me a very long time to finish. This book took me like 2 weeks to finish. The Oxford Handbook of Freedom, this blue one, took me a long time to finish. And the Confessions is pretty short. So let's talk about these. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Oxford Handbook of Freedom. This was actually a pretty fun book to read. I kind of found that it was a bit repetitive in the sense that a lot of the philosophical ideas around freedom, even though they can be applied to different topics, are not that unique. And what happened in this book, for example, was there was a debate quite routinely about this very famous essay called The Two Concepts of Freedom. This notion that you have a freedom to do something and you have a freedom from something. Republicanism was talked about a little bit as well, which was a bit repetitive. And when you would talk about like clashes between values, so a lot of the times they would talk about whether equality and freedom were one and the same, or whether they could actually be mutually exclusive sometimes, or could you have high levels of equality with like low levels of freedom? Could you have high levels of freedom with low levels of equality? These kinds of questions. That stuff gets a bit repetitive towards the end of the book, but in the intro, in the beginning of the book, it is fun to like go through these different topics. They also talk about Adam Smith's self-command theory, which I thought was a very interesting take on freedom, that you can't have freedom unless you have some kind of self-command, and in order to have self-command, you need things like discipline. I think that's a very interesting approach to freedom. Overall, if you're looking for a good book to cover the topic of freedom, I would recommend this. If you're somebody who's already very familiar, even with just a few philosophical texts on the topic of freedom, you might find that this one is too basic, or you might find that freedom literature repeats itself a little bit too frequently. Now, this next book, Afghanistan, A History from 1260 to the Present, was fantastic. The book, I would probably say 80% is focused on earlier time periods of Afghanistan. There's a lot more interesting stuff that goes on in the earlier time periods. He does cover some of the more recent stuff. However, I found that it wasn't as exhaustive as it could have been, but this book is already so big, so I'm not like, that's not a critique. I'm just saying I've read more thoroughgoing histories of modern Afghanistan. Not that this is not thorough, it's just he only has so much room, right? So he does cover some of the modern stuff. This book is fantastic. So it reads like a Game of Thrones novel sometimes, because it's a history that is told from the perspective of leaders and how these different leaders had different strategies to overcome one another. It talks about the British Empire's influence in Afghanistan and how the British and the Russians were kind of fighting each other in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan for the British was actually a way to defend their interest in India, and also to avoid Russia from coming into Pakistan to push for an independent. I think it was like a Pushtunistan, I think it was called, something like this. Russia wanted to push for separatist movements in that region that were very anti-British. There was a lot of interesting leaders in the various Afghan dynasties that I actually think some of them were pretty admirable, and obviously some of them had very obvious shortcomings, which was really fun to read about. I really like reading histories that show the decisions, how the decisions of leaders have impacted the outcomes of history. I really like that, which this book does quite a lot. And it really came, like, I would have to say, out of all the countries I've read histories about, Afghanistan has the most Machiavellian politics I've ever seen. Everybody, as far as this book was saying, everybody undermines each other. Everybody plots against one another. There is very little cooperation between the tribes. And when there is, it's because they're all self-serving. Afghanistan was a country that I think it has like 6 major ethnic groups and 30 different dialects, or no, not even dialects, I believe it's languages. Yeah, very interesting country to read about. And this book has made me far more interested in the future of Afghanistan as well. So I actually want to get some more books on what has happened since like 2020 to present, because I'm really vested now into the future of Afghanistan and what's going to happen to this country. Next book is The Confessions by St Augustine. I went into this book thinking it was going to be more of an autobiography. And I have to say, it is not at all like an autobiography. I know it's technically him talking about his life and what he did wrong, which is, technically it's an autobiography, but it's more so like his philosophy being used to analyze the actions he engaged in life. I almost compare him to Jordan Peterson because the book really reads like a lot of analytical reflections on previous actions in life, which was fun. And I found that while I was reading it, I didn't notice that I was getting much from it. But after having been reading it for like a week and having some of the kind of themes baked into my brain, so to speak, baked into my unconscious, I began to reflect more, almost on an unconscious level, about my own actions in life and whether I would come to regret them in the future or whether I would view them as too sinful in the future. So this book, I'd say, for that reason, has had a little bit of an impact on me, which I didn't expect. And another bonus is that the writing style is magnificent. It's written very fancifully. The only way I can really describe his writing is like concrete, devoid of gerunds, and maybe more like old classical, kind of classical prose, you could say. It's very fun to read. The one drawback, however, is I would say there's a very obvious bias that he comes from when he gives his ideas, and he's not ashamed of his bias, which is fine. But the philosophical sophistication that he has when he defends his bias inside this book is not that robust. It's kind of like the high school theology. And maybe in his defense, there weren't as many books around back then, and so the equivalent of a modern day PhD back then would be like maybe somebody who's really at a high school level in current days. It's maybe like a fair interpretation. He doesn't seem dumb, but it could just be that a lack of access to literature. And so all the arguments that he did have seemed kind of, they seemed kind of high school level. So that was one drawback. But I wouldn't read this book for that reason. I'd read this book because it's someone who's kind of reflecting on their actions in life in a very profound or overly intellectual way, you could say. And this last book, The Rules of St Benedict, I don't recommend reading at all, unless you want to live your life in accordance to like a monastic order. I thought when I was going to read this book, it was going to be the moral prescriptions of an abbot for how to live your life mentally, not how to live your life physically. There are things in here that I wasn't expecting. So like, let's say when you should be eating, how you should punish people who, like, say, don't read the Bible or say their prayers or something. At what time you should say your prayers. How an abbot should dress, or how gifts should be received at the church, or so on and so forth. Stuff like that. There is some stuff about like moral prescriptions, like how to view temptations and so on and so forth. But I would say that's only in the beginning of the book. Like, for example, what kind of man the abbot should be. But then after that, you have summoning the brothers for consultation. I don't need to know about that. Right? That's not what I wanted. I wanted stuff about like moral prescriptions on how to live your life when it comes to either temptations or pursuing your dreams or becoming a virtuous person. So that's not what this book is. And I would say don't read it unless you're really interested in how to run a monastic order. So that's what I've been reading for the last month or so. I have started another Afghan history book called Ghost Wars, which I'm really excited about. And I need to finish reading Debt, the First 5,000 Years. I've just been really busy. I haven't forgot about that. I'm going to continue reading it. But with that being said, let me know what you think about these books. I highly recommend that Afghan history book. And bye-bye for now.